The sun was a dying copper eye over the alkali flats of Alder Mesa, bleeding its last light onto the grit and hardpan. Dust, red as rust, coated everything. It powdered the flanks of the heat-stunned horses tied to the hitching rail, and it settled in the creases of the few men moving along the boardwalk. It was a thirsty, choking dust, the kind that defined the edges of the 1870s high desert, and most of it seemed to be rolling in a lazy plume from the bat-wing doors of the Blue Kestrel Saloon. Inside, the air was thick enough to chew. It stank of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, bitter tobacco smoke, and the sour floorboards that hadn't seen a real scrubbing since the place was built. A tinny piano was being punished in the corner by a man who knew chords but no music. Laughter, sharp and sudden, barked from a table where drovers played cards, their faces shadowed by the low-hanging kerosene lamps. And in the center of it all, standing on a platform made of 2 upended barrels and a warped plank, was Tamsin Rowe. Her brother, Cyrus, put her there. Cyrus Rowe, a man whose spine had been dissolved by cheap liquor, shoved her up onto the makeshift stage. His hands were shaking, not with rage, but with a desperate, aching need for his next drink. He owed the saloon keeper, Silas, a sum that might as well have been the moon. Having lost his horse, his saddle, and his gun at the faro table, he was left with only one marker to play. "She's strong," Cyrus bellowed, his voice whiskey-rotted and cracking. "Good for chores, cooking whatever you need." The men laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. They turned from their cards and their warm beers, their eyes landing on Tamsin. She did not look like she belonged. Even with the raw rope biting into her wrists, tied tight in front of her, and a sickening violet bruise staining her left cheekbone where Cyrus's knuckles had met her. She held a stillness. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was escaping a frayed bun. But her eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they were utterly, terrifyingly calm. She did not weep. She did not plead. She simply looked out at the faces, the leering, the curious, the indifferent, and met their gaze, one by one, as if refusing to be ground into the same grit that covered the floor. She wasn't livestock. She was a witness. Silas, the owner, a bald man with a belly that strained his apron, stepped up. He didn't have a gavel. He picked up an empty whiskey bottle by the neck, wiped the mouth on his sleeve, and tapped its heavy base against the bar. Thud. Thud. The room quieted, the piano player trailing off into a nervous silence. "All right, boys, you heard the man," Silas announced, his voice oily with enterprise. "Cyrus here is squaring his debt, the girl's indenture. We'll call it, he's offering her labor, her time, the whole contract, bought and paid for. We'll start the bidding low, just to get things moving. How about 2 jugs of rye and 10 hard dollars?" A few whistles cut the air. $10 was a month's wages for some. But 2 jugs of rye? That was an investment they understood. "I got $10, shouted a prospector from the back, his beard matted with grime. "But does she come with the $10, or do I gotta pay extra for company?" More laughter. Tamsin's gaze found him, held him, and the man's laugh died in his throat, making him look away and shuffle his feet. In the deepest shadows of the saloon, leaning against a warped support beam that held up the sagging ceiling, a man watched. He had entered so quietly 10 minutes prior that only the floorboards had noticed. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, and wore a dark duster coated not just in dust, but in the grime of 1,000 miles of hard travel. This was Calder Wynn, a name spoken rarely, and usually in reference to the sprawling, isolated ranch at Hollow Spur. They called him the Lonely Rancher, a man who bought cattle but never stayed for a drink, who spoke to his horse more than he spoke to people. Calder watched, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He wasn't looking at Tamsin the way the others were. He wasn't assessing her curves or her teeth. He was watching the rope on her wrists. He was measuring the tremors in Cyrus's hands. He was noting the exits. Cyrus, emboldened by the first potential bid, spat on the floor. "Hell, seller, and my debt's clear, that's all I care about. Whoever pays the freight." He grinned. a terrible, gap-toothed expression. Can put a ring on her for all I care. Marry her, even... A new murmur rippled through the room. This was different. Not just hiring labor, but ownership. The idea settled, heavy and dangerous. Tamsin's chin, which had been held high, dipped for just a second. Her eyes closed. A single whisper, so quiet it was barely more than breath, escaped her lips. It wasn't meant for anyone. It was a prayer, or a curse. Don't let him choose for me again. The words were tiny, lost in the smoke, but sound traveled strangely in a silent room. Calder Wynne, 10 yards away, heard them. The words didn't strike him as sad. They struck him like a splinter of ice, sharp and sudden, lodging deep under the skin. Again, at a small table near the window, another man who did not fit in watched the proceedings with a different kind of interest. He was dour, clean-shaven, and wore a black town coat, remarkable only for its lack of trail dust. This was Deacon Pike. He sipped slowly from a glass of water. His eyes, cold and assessing, weren't on Tamsin's face, but on her neck, just below her jawline, where her frayed collar dipped. A thin, silvery white line marked her skin, an old scar, faint as a spider's thread. Deacon Pike lowered his gaze, pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from his breast pocket, and uncapped a pencil. He wrote a few short words, his movements precise and economical. The crowd was hesitating. The prospector had the $10, but the idea of marrying her had spooked him. Others looked at her stiff-backed defiance and saw only trouble. Going once. Silas, the owner, pushed, sensing the mood failing. $10 and 2 jugs, a bargain for a sturdy woman. The room held its breath. Tamsin braced herself, her eyes fixed on a crack in the ceiling. Then, a new sound, the scrape of boot leather on gritty wood. Calder Wynne pushed himself off the support beam. He didn't walk fast. His spurs, muffled with leather, made only the faintest chink. He didn't walk toward Tamsin. He walked toward the bar. The men turned, watching him. Calder ignored them all. He reached the bar, his back to Cyrus and his property. He unfastened a heavy buckskin pouch from his belt and, without a word, turned it upside down. It wasn't a clink. It was a cascade, a heavy, rich waterfall of metal onto the scarred wood of the bar. Gold, half-eagles and double-eagles, shining dully in the lamplight, rolling and settling into a pile worth 100 times the opening bid. The saloon went dead silent. The piano player flinched. Cyrus's jaw dropped, his eyes bulging at the sudden, impossible wealth. Calder Wynne placed his gloved hand flat on the bar. Next to the pile, he turned his head, his gaze finding Silas, then moving past him to Cyrus. His voice, when it came, was low, rough from disuse, but it carried to every corner of the room. She rides with me now. It was not a bid. It was a statement of fact. Cyrus made a strangled noise, half rage, half animal greed. The gold had locked his throat. He looked from the pile of coins to his sister, his mind trying to reconcile the whiskey he was owed with the fortune lying on the bar. The gold won. He lunged for it, his shaking hands scooping and clawing at the coins. Calder paid him no mind. He turned and walked the few steps to the makeshift stage. Tamsin watched him approach, her expression unchanged, but her breathing had stopped. He stopped a foot away from her. He didn't reach for her. He didn't touch her. The men in the room half expected him to throw her over his shoulder like a sack of feed. Instead, Calder Wynne reached into his duster and pulled out a small, clean whittling knife. He opened it, the blade catching the light. He didn't grab her wrists. He lifted the knife and, with one sure, quick motion, sliced through the fiber of the rope binding her. The rope fell away, landing softly on the plank. Her hands, red and raw, remained in the air for a moment before she slowly lowered them. Calder sheathed the knife. He looked at her bruised face, his eyes shadowed by his hat. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice still low, meant only for her. For the first time, Tamsin Rowe moved. She gave a single, sharp nod. She gathered the frayed edges of her dignity, lifted her skirt slightly, and stepped down from the barrel platform. The sound of her worn boot heels on the plank floor was dry and absolute. She stood on her own, facing the man who had just bought her. "Let's go," Calder said. He gestured to the batwing doors. He didn't lead her. He walked beside her, his body placing him between her and the stunned, resentful crowd. The men parted like water around a boulder, their eyes following the rancher and the girl. They pushed through the doors, stepping from the hot, smoky prison into the cool, sharp air of the twilight. The red dust had begun to settle, and the first stars were appearing in the violet sky. Back inside the blue kestrel, Deacon Pike made one final notation in his book. He closed it with a soft snap. He didn't look at the gold, and he didn't look at the drooling, triumphant Cyrus. He watched through the window as the two figures, the tall rancher and the woman, moved toward the stables. His gaze, cold as polished steel, followed them until they disappeared into the growing darkness. The swing doors of the blue kestrel slapped shut, cutting off the sudden, shocked silence of the room behind them. The evening air felt impossibly cold against Tamsin's bruised cheek, a sharp, clean slap of reality. Alder Mesa was already sinking into the deep purple of twilight. Calder Wynn didn't pause. He moved past her toward the hitching rail where two horses stood waiting. One was a tall, muscular bay, restless and powerful, clearly his own mount. The other was a sturdy gray mare with a calm eye, saddled and carrying a light pack. He'd come to town prepared for a long ride, not a rescue. He untied the bay's reins, then moved to the gray mare. He checked the cinch, his movements economical and sure, and then he turned, holding the reins out to her. He didn't speak. He just offered. Tamsin looked at the leather straps, then at his gloved hand. Her own hands, raw from the cut rope, throbbed. She took the reins. The leather was worn smooth, solid in her grasp. She put a foot in the stirrup, her body aching with a dozen bruises, and pulled herself up. She was clumsy, exhausted, but she made it, settling into the saddle. The mare, Mistral, merely flicked an ear, unbothered. Calder swung onto his bay in one fluid motion. For a moment, they just sat, two riders in the dying light, the sounds of a saloon stirring back to life behind them. Then, without a word, Calder turned his horse south, away from the main street, and Tamsin nudged Mistral to follow. They rode out of Alder Mesa not with a thunder of hooves, but with a quiet, deliberate pace, vanishing into the chaparral as the desert night closed in. The journey to Hollow Spur Ranch was marked by silence. There was no sound but the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of 4 hooves on the hard-packed earth, the steady creak of saddle leather, and the occasional jingle of a bridle chain. A pale crescent moon climbed the sky, thin as a fingernail clipping, casting just enough light to turn the landscape into a ghostly panorama of silver and black. They rode along the shallow, whispering cut of Bitter Creek. The water, where it caught the moonlight, glittered like a broken mirror. Tamsin kept Mistral a careful 3 horse lengths behind Calder's bay. She watched his back. It was a broad, solid wall, covered by the dark duster, unmoving except for the roll of his shoulders with the horse's gait. She was not his prisoner, not in the way she had been Cyrus's. The ropes were gone, but she was not free. She was acquired, a piece of property moved from one owner to another, purchased with a staggering pile of gold. This man, Calder Wynn, had paid a fortune for her. The question that echoed with every hoofbeat was, why her eyes, sharp and accustomed to the dark, scanned the shadows on either side of the creek bed. She watched the ridge lines, looking for the telltale silhouette of a man or a horse that did not belong. She was a creature tuned to the frequency of danger, and every nerve was still humming. She rode with her back straight, her hands light but ready on the reins, projecting a calmness she did not feel, after what felt like hours, perhaps close to 2. Calder reined in his bay. Tamsin stopped Mistral behind him. The air was colder here, the canyon walls rising steeper. He didn't turn fully in the saddle. He just gestured with a gloved hand toward a massive, jagged shadow that blotted out the stars to the west. It was a mountain, stark and black. "Cinder Butte," he said. His voice was the same as in the saloon, low, gravelly, carrying easily in the stillness. "The ranch is tucked against its base. That butte, it keeps the worst of the weather off us. And most of the people." He paused, letting the silence settle again. "No one rides up to Hollow Spur unless they're invited." It was a statement, but it landed like a promise, or a warning. Tamsin wasn't sure which. She just nodded, her throat too tight and dry to speak. He nudged his horse forward, and they began to climb, leaving the creek bed for a narrow, winding trail cut into the rock. The path was steep, and the horses labored, their breath pluming in the cold. Tamsin leaned forward, trusting the gray mare's footing. Finally, they crested the rise. Below them lay a wide, dark basin, a hollow in the earth sheltered on three sides by high ridges, with the towering mass of Cinder Butte as its northern wall. In the center, a few faint lights glowed. They rode down into the basin. Tamsin could make out the shapes of a long, low ranch house, a large barn, and several corrals. It was isolated, utterly the kind of place a person could disappear into, whether they wanted to or not. They reached a wide gate made of thick timber, held shut by a heavy iron chain, its links dark with rust. Calder dismounted. He didn't pull a key. He simply unhooked the chain from its post, his movements practiced. The clank of the metal was loud in the night. He swung the gate open, the wood scraping softly on the ground. He stood by the open gate, holding it, waiting for her to pass through. He looked up at her, his face still mostly hidden by the shadow of his hat, the faint moonlight catching only the hard line of his jaw. "In here," he said, and his voice was softer now, almost rough with some unreadable emotion. "In here, no one puts a price on you again." Tamsin urged Mistral forward, riding past him, under the wooden arch. She felt a tremor pass through her, a strange, terrifying lurch of something. It wasn't relief. It was the shock of a new idea. She heard him close the gate behind her, the chain rattling back into place. It sounded final. He led the way to the barn, and they dismounted in silence. He lit a lantern, the yellow glow pushing back the shadows, revealing stalls clean swept and filled with fresh hay. He took Mistral's reins from her. "I'll see to them," he said. "House is unlocked, kitchen's warm." Tamsin hesitated, her feet feeling nailed to the barn floor. He'd bought her. He'd brought her to this fortress in the hills, and now he was sending her into his house. Alone. "Go on," he said, not unkindly. He turned to the mare, already loosening the girth. Tamsin walked out of the barn. The night air was biting. She crossed the 20 yards of packed earth to the ranch house, her boots sounding hollow. She put her hand on the wooden latch of the door. It felt solid. She pushed it open and stepped inside. It was a kitchen, large, simple, and blessedly warm. A massive cast-iron stove dominated one wall, its belly glowing faintly red, radiating a deep, steady heat. A pot sat on top, simmering, and the air smelled of beans, salt pork, and coffee. A scrubbed wooden table sat in the center of the room. She stood just inside the door, her senses overwhelmed. The warmth, the smell of food. It was a violent contrast to the saloon's stench and the cold terror of the ride. She heard his boots on the porch steps. The door opened behind her, and he entered, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He was large in the confined space, his duster seeming to fill the room. He hung his hat and the coat on a peg by the door. Without them, he was just a man, broad-shouldered in a plain work shirt, his features weathered, his eyes a surprisingly light gray. He moved to the stove, took a tin plate from a shelf, and ladled a thick helping of bean stew from the pot. He added a chunk of cornbread from a pan covered with a cloth. He set the plate on the table, along with a spoon and a mug of water. He did this all without looking directly at her. Then he placed the meal, not in front of her, but at one end of the table. He slid a chair out, and then he stepped back. He retreated to the far side of the room, near the stove, and poured himself a mug of black coffee. He leaned against the wall, sipping it, giving her the entire table, the entire meal, and the entire illusion of choice. Tamsin's stomach twisted, half in hunger, half in suspicion. This was a test. Everything was a test. But the smell she hadn't eaten since a piece of dry bread that morning, slowly, as if moving against a strong current. She walked to the table. She pulled the chair out. She sat. She stared at the steam rising from the beans. She picked up the spoon. Her hand, she noted with a distant anger, was shaking. She took a bite. It was hot, salty, and real. She took another. She ate slowly, deliberately, forcing herself not to tear at the food like a starving animal. Her movements were stiff, her senses still stretched tight. Her eyes kept darting to the open doorway that led to the rest of the house, and back to the main door she'd come through. She was a bobcat in a box trap, eating the bait but knowing the door was shut. Calder drank his coffee. He didn't speak. He didn't watch her. He just occupied the space, a silent, powerful presence. The only sounds were the scrape of her spoon against the tin plate and the crackle of the wood in the stove. When she was finished, she placed the spoon on the empty plate. Calder pushed off the wall and set his mug down. He pointed up. "There's a loft," he said, "above this room. It's warm. Clean blankets." He walked to a narrow, steep set of stairs in the corner that she hadn't noticed. At the base, he picked up a fresh folded blanket and a pillow from a chest. He walked up the stairs, his boots heavy on the wood. He disappeared into the darkness above. Tamsin stood, her hands clenched. Was she to follow? He reappeared a moment later, empty-handed. He walked back down, stopping on the third step from the bottom. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object, an old, black iron key. He held it out to her. "The door at the top of the stairs," he said, his voice quiet. "It's solid wood. It locks from the inside." Tamsin stared at the key. He continued, "My room is at the far end of the hall. You'll have the loft. No one will bother you." He tossed the key lightly. It was an easy underhand throw. Tamsin's hand shot out, catching it. The metal was cold and heavy in her palm, the teeth sharp against her skin. "The key's in your hand, Tamsin," he said, speaking her name for the first time. It sounded strange, solid, in his mouth. She looked from the key to his face. His gray eyes were steady. He was just watching, waiting. She nodded once. "Good night," he said. He turned, walked through the dark doorway, and his footsteps faded down the hall. Tamsin stood alone in the kitchen for a full minute, the silence roaring in her ears. She looked at the key in her hand. It was a simple, primitive thing, a bit of iron, but it felt heavier than the pile of gold he'd thrown on the bar. It was the first key she had held in memory. Cyrus had always kept the locks. Other men had always kept the locks. She climbed the stairs, her legs trembling with fatigue. The loft was a wide, low-ceilinged space under the eaves, smelling of dried herbs and cedar. A single lantern was lit, turned low. In the corner, on a simple cot, was the blanket and pillow he'd left. And the door it was, as he'd said, thick planks of wood. On her side, there was a heavy iron lock, the keyhole waiting. She slid the key in. It turned with a satisfying, heavy clack. The bolt shot home. Tamsin leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door, her fingers still wrapped around the knob of the key. She didn't weep. The time for that was long past. But a single, ragged breath escaped her. A small piece of metal, a small, locked room. It was not freedom, but it was, perhaps, the beginning of it. That night, she did not sleep. She sat on the cot, wrapped in the blanket, the key still clutched in her hand. She listened to the sounds of the house, the creak of aging wood, the sigh of the wind as it curled down from Cinder Butte, and below, in the yard, she heard the faint, muffled crunch of boots on dirt. Calder Wynne was not sleeping either. He had his rifle, and he was walking the perimeter. He moved from the barn to the corrals, then out toward the gate, a dark shadow in the moonlight. He checked the wind. He listened to the coyotes yipping in the high hills. He was a man guarding his fortress. He, too, was waiting. And far, far away, on a distant ridge overlooking the entire basin, a tiny spark of orange glowed and faded in the dark. It was the cherry-red tip of a cigar. Deacon Pike exhaled a thin stream of smoke into the cold night air. He lowered his spyglass, his eyes having followed the lights of the ranch house until the last one, the kitchen light, went out. He made a small mark in his notebook. Hollow Spur Ranch. He had found their trail. The first light of dawn was a cold, gray smear across the high desert when Tamsin woke. For a confused second, she didn't know where she was. Her body ached, a deep, comprehensive soreness, and her hand was clenched tight. She opened her fist and saw the black iron key resting in her palm. The loft. Hollow Spur. She sat up, the wool blanket pooling around her waist. She had not slept. Not truly, but had drifted in a state of hyper-vigilant exhaustion, listening to the wind prowl around the eaves and the distant, lonely call of a coyote. Below, the house had been silent. She dressed in the clothes she'd arrived in, grimacing at the dirt and the memory they held. Her wrists were raw, the rope burns a fiery red. She found a strip of clean cotton, part of an old shirt, perhaps left on a crate, and tore it, bandaging her hands with stiff, clumsy movements. Finally, she walked to the door. She put the key in the lock and turned it. The sound of the bolt sliding back was a heavy, final thud. She walked down the steep stairs. The kitchen was empty, but a fire was already crackling in the stove. A big tin coffee pot bubbling on its surface. A mug, identical to the one he'd used, sat waiting for her. She poured the coffee, black and scalding, and cradled the mug, letting the heat seep into her chilled fingers. The gesture felt foreign. Simple. She stepped outside. The morning was sharp and vast, the air so clean it stung her lungs. The sun was just beginning to touch the jagged peak of Cinder Butte, turning the rock a fiery orange. She saw him, not at the house, but by the barn. He was mending a piece of harness, his back to her. But he wasn't what caught her eye. Resting on the corral fence, just outside the barn door, were two items. The first was a pair of deer-hide gloves. They were new, the leather soft and pale, the stitching precise. They were small, clearly meant for a woman's hands. The second item was a saddle. It was not the heavy, man-style saddle she had ridden last night. This was a side saddle, its leather old but meticulously cared for. It was built for balance and safety, with a leaping horn and a single, shielded stirrup. Tamsin approached the item slowly, as if they might be a trap. She touched the leather of the glove. It was my mother's. Calder's voice came from behind her. He hadn't turned, but he'd clearly seen her. He finished pulling a thread tight on the harness, his movements economical. The saddle, the gloves are new. He finally turned, wiping his hands on his trousers. She rode that saddle all over this basin, the stirrups safer. A stock saddle, a man can get his boot caught, but he can also kick free. A woman, riding astride in skirts, can get tangled. He looked at her bandaged wrists, then back at the saddle. With this, he said, nodding to the side saddle, you won't be pulled. Tamsin didn't know what to say. Thank you felt too small, too cheap. She ran her hand over the tooled leather of the seat. It was a tool, like the key, a tool for control. She found her hands moving automatically, checking the cinch, testing the strap. Her fingers, even through the bandages, remembered the work. Cyrus, he sold me before. The words were out before she decided to speak them. They hung in the cold air, thin and sharp. Calder stopped his work. He didn't turn to stare, but his body went still. He just listened. He called it temporary. She continued, her voice flat, her eyes fixed on the saddle strap. A week to work in a laundry in Adobe Springs, so he could have whiskey money. A few days, mucking stalls at a way station, for a bottle. He'd trade me, like a pocket knife, then he'd come back, crying, saying he was a terrible brother, until the next thirst. Her hand stopped moving. This last time was different. It wasn't for a bottle. It was to clear a poker debt. 2 men at the Double H line camp. He owed them nearly $40. She swallowed, the air catching in her throat. They weren't looking for a cook. They kept me in the cabin. For 3 days, they drank, and they argued about who owned what. The silence from Calder was absolute. He was a stone wall. Tamsin's hand, unbidden, rose to her neck, her fingers brushing the faint, pale line just below her collar. The second night, the older one, he said property needed a mark. To stop the arguing, he pulled a line tie iron from his saddlebag, a simple cross. He put it in the stove, to heat it. She was back there. She could smell the pine smoke, the sour whiskey, the stink of the hot iron. They'd tied my hands, but they used an old rope. They tied me to the main post in the cabin. I had found a piece of a plate, broken porcelain, sharp. I'd hidden it in my boot when they brought me in. While they were arguing while he was heating the iron I was cutting. Her voice was a rasp. I heard him take the iron from the stove. I heard him. I cut through. I ran. I just ran. I ran for the door. The other one grabbed the end of the rope I was still tied to. It snapped tight, just as I hit the doorway. Her fingers clenched on her neck. It wasn't the iron that marked me. It was the rope he used to hold me for it. She finished. The story lay bare on the ground between them, ugly and bleeding. Calder stood unmoving for a full minute. His knuckles were white where he gripped the piece of harness. He didn't offer pity. He didn't say it was all right. He didn't curse them. He simply absorbed the story, making it a fact of the landscape, like the rocks and the wind. Finally, he let out a slow breath. He set the harness piece down. He looked at her, his gray eyes clear, and asked the one question that mattered. Where do you want to go? Tamsin. The question stunned her. No one had asked her what she wanted, ever. She looked away from him, up at the vast, empty, sunlit ridge of Hollow Spur. Where did she want to go? I don't know where to go, she said, the words heavy and true. I want to be somewhere I choose. The tension hung between them, unbearable, thick as molasses. It was broken by a sound, a thin, desperate, high-pitched whinny from the dark recesses of the barn. Calder's head snapped up. Damn it, he bit out. That Palomino. She wasn't due for another 3 weeks. He was moving before the words were even finished, disappearing into the barn. Tamsin, her own horrifying confession instantly eclipsed by a new, immediate crisis, followed him without a second thought. In a large stall at the back, a pale gold mare was pacing, distressed and sweating, nuzzling at a small, wet shape in the hay. It was a foal, impossibly tiny, its coat matted and dark. It lay on its side, its spindly legs jerking feebly. It was trying to breathe, its ribs heaving, but only a faint gasp came out. It's too early, Calder said, his voice hard with pragmatism. He knelt, running a hand over the foal's body. Its lungs aren't ready. It's not going to make it. Get a clean blanket and warm water, if you have it, now. The voice was Tamsin's, but it was not the voice he had heard. This one was sharp, clear, and full of command. He stared at her for 1/2 second, surprised by the authority. Then he turned and ran for the house. Tamsin dropped to her knees in the hay. Come on, little one, she whispered, her hands, which had been shaking, suddenly becoming sure and precise. Come on, now. You're a fighter. She grabbed handfuls of clean straw. She cleared the foal's muzzle and nostrils, then began rubbing its tiny body, starting at the neck and working down its ribs, vigorous and rough, trying to stimulate the muscles, the blood, the lungs. Breathe, damn you, breathe! Calder returned, carrying an old wool blanket and a steaming bucket. He stopped, watching. The woman he'd bought from a saloon, the victim of his brother's cruelty, was working with a practiced, desperate expertise. Her hands were shaking, yes, but they knew every rib, every muscle. He realized, with a jolt, that she was more at home in this stall than he was. The foal gave a weak, sputtering cough, then a real, shuddering gasp. "That's it," Tamsin murmured, not looking up. "That's it. You're here." She didn't stop rubbing, wrapping the foal in the dry blanket, rubbing it through the wool. "You're a fighter, aren't you? You're a fighter." They worked for an hour. Tamsin coaxed the mare to stand still, helped the foal, now breathing shallowly but regularly, to wiggle its way toward its mother. Finally. Tamsin sat back on her heels, exhausted, covered in hay and sweat, but her eyes were brighter than he'd ever seen them. Calder leaned against the stall door, arms crossed. "You've done this before." Tamsin stroked the foal's damp head. "My mother," she said, her voice soft again, the command gone. "Before she passed, she raised horses. Morgan's. It was the only thing Cyrus never touched. He was afraid of them. I think it was the only thing he was ever afraid of." She looked at the foal, which was now trying weakly to lift its head. "It'll need a name," Calder said quietly. Tamsin looked around the barn. Her gaze fell on a bundle of silvery green branches with pale berries, hung from the rafters to dry. "Juniper," she said. "For the berries. They're tough, and they can be bitter, but they always survive the winter." She was, in that moment, naming them both, a quiet ritual, sealed in the warm, hay-scented air of the barn, a promise of survival. That evening, the kitchen felt different. The oppressive silence of the night before was gone, replaced by a quiet companionship. Tamsin had worked all day, her hands aching, but her mind clear. She'd mended the fence on the gray mare, Mistral, using the side saddle. It had felt strange, secure. She had chosen to work. They ate the same meal as the night before, bean stew and cornbread, but tonight they sat at the same table. After the plates were cleared, Calder stood. He walked to the carved wooden mantel over the cold fireplace, where a small, dark box sat. He opened it and took something out. He came back to the table. He wasn't holding a key or a tool. He held a folded square of silk. It was old, the color of a deep twilight sky, a rich, vibrant blue. "This was my mother's too," he said, his voice gruff, as if he were embarrassed. She loved this place. She said this color matched the shadows on the snow, right at dusk." Tamsin stared at it. It was beautiful. It was, she realized, the first truly beautiful thing she had been offered, perhaps ever. "I can't," she started, her hand instinctively going to her neck. "It's just a scarf," he interrupted, pushing it across the table. "If you like it, use it how you want." Tamsin reached out, her fingers brushing the cool, whispering silk. She picked it up. It was light as air. She unfolded it, a generous square. She looked at Calder, saw him watching her, his expression unreadable. Deliberately, she folded the silk into a long triangle. She lifted her chin. She wrapped the scarf around her neck, the fabric soft and cool against her skin. She tied it loosely, the knot to the side, letting the ends fall over her shoulder. It covered the faint, silvery line of the rope scar. It wasn't hidden. It was claimed. The scar was still there, beneath the silk. But it was no longer the only thing telling her story. The blue silk was... The single oil lamp on the table cast a small, warm circle of light, illuminating her face, and Tamsin smiled. It was not the tight, painful grimace from the saloon. It was not the wary, closed expression of the morning. It was a small, hesitant lifting at the corners of her mouth, but it was real. And it reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Thank you for not asking my price again." Calder Wynne held her gaze for a long moment, his own throat tight. He gave a single, curt nod and looked down at his empty cup. Miles away, at the edge of the ranch's property line, the moon was high and bright, washing the sagebrush in silver. Deacon Pike lay flat on a ridge, his spyglass trained on the distant ranch house. He had watched them all day, watched them in the barn, watched her ride the fence line. He lowered the glass, a flicker of professional satisfaction in his cold eyes. He crawled backward, silent as a lizard, to where his horse was tied in a dense copse of manzanita. He struck a match, shielding it in his hand, and lit his cigar, the tip glowing orange. He knelt by the tracks he'd found earlier, Calder Wynn's Big Bay, and the smaller, neater tracks of the gray mare. He'd measured them. He opened his small, leather-bound book. In the moonlight, he wrote, Hollow Spur Ranch, 2 people. He paused, took a pull from the cigar, and added, 1 female, scar. Left neck. He closed the book with a soft snap. He knew where she was. Now, it was just a matter of time. Deacon Pike did not ride back to Alder Mesa. He rode northeast for 30 miles, to the town of Larkspur Basin. It wasn't a town so much as an administrative scar on the landscape, a place built of unpainted wood and bureaucratic ink. It held the county clerk's office, a land registry, and a federal marshal's satellite post that was empty 9/10 of the year. He tethered his horse and entered the clerk's office, his movements precise, his black coat shedding no dust. The clerk, a man named Hobb, was small, with watery eyes and ink stains all the way to his elbows. He looked up, annoyed, from a massive ledger. Office is closing in 5 minutes, Hobb said, his voice a reedy whine. Deacon Pike laid a single, crisp $5 bill on the counter. Hobb's eyes fixed on it. I have a judicial notice that needs a territorial stamp. A formality, Deacon said. His voice was flat, devoid of negotiation. He unrolled a piece of paper. It was a wanted poster. Wanted for theft vagrancy. Rosa Quinn. $50 reward. Below. The description was brief but exact female. Approx. 23, 25 years. Height 5.5 feet. Hair dark blonde. Eyes blue-gray. Slender build. Distinguishing mark, fine scar. Left side of neck. Below jawline. Hobb read it, his eyes widening slightly at the description of the scar. He looked back at the $5 bill. This ain't from our circuit, Judge. I don't recognize the signature. It's from the Southern Territory. Judge Miller. His clerk missed the stamp. Deacon lied smoothly. It's a costly error. I've tracked her all this way, and I can't take her across the line back to Miller without the proper territorial seal. It's just paperwork. He pushed a second $5 bill onto the counter, placing it neatly beside the first. $10 for the inconvenience of keeping you past closing, and for the ink. Hobb licked his lips. $10 was a full week's pay. He looked at the poster again. Theft and vagrancy. It was a minor charge. Not murder, not a federal crime. Just a woman who'd skipped town. It happened all the time. It's just to make it legal. Hobb, Deacon said, his voice dropping, as if sharing a confidence. So I can get paid, and this Rosa can face the judge she ran from. It's about order. Hobb swallowed. He opened his drawer, pulled out the heavy brass stamp of the Larkspur Basin Territorial Office, and inked it on the purple pad. He lined it up carefully at the bottom of the poster. Thud. He pressed down, his small body leaning on it, making the seal official. The fake was now, for all intents and purposes, real. Deacon Pike smiled, a thin, cold expression. He slid the $10 across the counter, carefully rolled the poster, and tucked it into an oilskin tube. A pleasure doing business, Mr. Hobb. He was out the door before Hobb had even finished putting the money in his pocket, the clerk already feeling the sour, metallic taste of the bribe in the back of his throat. 2 days' ride south, in the lawless, sprawling trade camp of Coyote Flat. Cyrus Rowe was drowning. He'd spent the last of Calder Wynn's gold, not all of it. He wasn't that stupid. He'd buried half of it under a rock out on the flats, but the half he'd kept, a handful of double eagles, had been enough to buy him 2 days of godhood at the bottom of a bottle. Now, he was just another drunk, his credit gone, the shakes returning, his head pounding with a venomous rage. He'd had everything. He'd had gold, and it was gone. He raged at the barman, at the gamblers who had cheated him they hadn't, and most of all, he raged at Tamsin. She had brought that silent, rich bastard down on him. She had cost him. He was staggering past the general store, his eyes squinting against the brutal noon sun, when he saw it, a new poster nailed to the community board, right next to a notice for horse studding. Wanted, Rosa Quinn. Cyrus stopped. He squinted, his vision blurry. He read the description. Hair dark blonde, eyes blue-gray, scar, left side of neck. He went cold, a coldness that cut right through the whiskey fog. Rosa Quinn. He knew that scar. He'd watched a rope put it there. It was Tamsin. He stared at the poster, his mind sharpened by a lifetime of rat-like cunning, spinning at a furious pace. Someone else was after her, someone with the law on their side, and they were paying $50. $50. It was an insult compared to the gold he'd just lost, but it was also a start. He ripped the poster from the board, heedless of the nail tearing the paper. He folded it, shoved it in his pocket, and started walking. He knew, with a drunk's instinct, where to find the kind of man who dealt in this trade. He found Deacon Pike in the back of a tent saloon, nursing the same glass of water, his black coat an accusation against the grime of the camp. "You," Cyrus slurred, slapping the torn poster on the rickety table. "You're looking for this Rosa woman." Deacon Pike did not look up. He was cleaning his fingernails with a small pocket knife. Well, I know her," Cyrus said, puffing his chest out. "That ain't her name. That's my sister, Tamsin Rowe." Deacon slowly folded the knife and looked up, his eyes empty. "Is that so?" "It is, and I know where she is." Cyrus grinned, his confidence returning. "She's with that rancher, the one who took her, Wynn, at Hollow Spur, up by Cinder Butte." Deacon nodded slowly, as if this were old, uninteresting news. "I know where Hollow Spur is, you fool. It's a fortress. You can't get within a mile of the house without being seen." "Ah," Cyrus wagged a triumphant, dirty finger. "You can't. Not from the south, not from the main trail. But you ain't from here." He leaned in, his breath a wave of sour mash. "I am. I've run from every lawman and debt collector in this territory. And I know a way in. A back way. A goat trail." Deacon Pike's eyes narrowed, just slightly. "It's called the Mesquite Draw," Cyrus whispered. "Comes down from the high ridge, right above the north pasture. Puts you 50 yards from the barn. And he'll never see you coming from that direction. He's always watching the basin." Deacon was silent for a long moment. He looked at the trembling, desperate man in front of him. A useful, disposable tool. "Information is valuable," Deacon said. He reached into his coat and produced two things. The first was a bottle of good bourbon, unopened. The second was a new Navy Colt revolver, its metal gleaming. Cyrus's eyes latched onto the gun, then the bottle. "Show me this Mesquite Draw," Deacon said, pushing the items across the table. "And these are yours. Fail, and I'll use this pistol to collect the fee for my wasted time." Cyrus grabbed the bottle, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. He didn't just smell money now. He smelled revenge, back at Hollow Spur. The days had found a new rhythm. It was a rhythm of work. Tamsin rode the gray mare, Mistral, her movements sure and confident in the side saddle, checking the fence lines for breaks. She worked with the horses, her quiet presence seeming to gentle even the most spooked colt. She worked, and in the working, she found a small, hard piece of her own mind. Calder, too, worked. He fixed what was broken. He tallied his stock. He prepared for the coming winter. But he was also watching. On the third morning after her arrival, he rode in from the high pasture, not with a placid expression, but with a hard, tight line to his jaw. He dismounted, Tamsin watching him from the porch where she was mending a blanket. "Company," he said. He wasn't talking to her, but to the air. He walked to his saddlebag and pulled out a small, cast-iron bell, no bigger than a man's thumb, with a tiny clapper. He walked to the main gate. Tamsin followed. He knelt by the trail, just inside the gate. "What is it?" Tamsin asked. He pointed. In the dust, pressed deep, was the print of a horseshoe. It was not one of his. It was small, neat, and the nails were in a pattern he didn't use. "Someone was here last night?" Calder said. "Stood right here, watching the house." He showed her another print, this one from a boot. He dismounted, watched for a while, got back on, rode north. Tamsin felt the cold dread return, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. "It's Pike," she whispered. "The man from the saloon, the one in the black coat." Calder nodded. "He's a patient man. That's worse than a fast one." He took a thin piece of wire from his pocket and strung it between the gatepost and a low-lying bush, just above the ground. He hung the tiny bell from it. "It's not much," he said, "but no one gets through this gate without ringing it." He spent the rest of the morning rigging 3 more bells on the trail from the south pasture and on the narrow path near the barn. That evening, Tamsin looked out the kitchen window into the vast, beautiful, terrifying darkness of the basin. The bells were a comfort, but they were a defense. "He'll have a reason," she said, her voice quiet. Calder looked up from the table where he was cleaning his rifle. "What do you mean? A man like that, he doesn't just want me. He's not like my brother. He's a planner. He'll have a paper. He'll have a reason to make it legal." Calder stopped cleaning. "A warrant, or a lie that looks like one," she said. She turned from the window. "Calder, we can't just wait for him to come. We can't just sit here and wait for the bells to ring. He'll come with the law behind him, and they'll believe his paper before they believe me." "What do you suggest?" he asked. "We have to get ahead of the lie," she said, her voice gaining a strange, cold certainty. "We have to find out what his lie is, and we have to show it's a fake. We have to fight him with paper, not just guns." Calder looked at her, a new respect dawning in his eyes. She was right. "There's a woman," he said after a moment, "in Brimstone Wash, Maeve Holliday. She runs the printing press. She doesn't like bounty men, and she hates forged paper more than anything. If Pike has posted a notice, it'll be in Brimstone. It's the biggest town in the circuit." They rode out before dawn, not on the main trail, but on a high, winding sheep path Calder knew, which kept them off the basin floor. Brimstone Wash was a 2-hour ride. It was a proper town, with a main street, a brick and timber bank, and a 2-story hotel. Maeve Holliday's print shop smelled of ink, lye, and paper. The woman herself was tall, with fiery red hair pulled back in a severe bun, and ink stains on her hands that matched Hobbs in Larkspur Basin. She was in her 40s, and her eyes missed nothing. She knew Calder. She nodded at him. Then her gaze settled on Tamsin. "Calder, you don't come to town for pleasantries." "What is it?" "We're looking for a notice. Maeve." Calder said, his voice low. "A bounty. A woman. Name of Tamsin Rowe, or maybe something else." Maeve's eyes sharpened. "Rowe, like Cyrus Rowe." "His sister," Tamsin said, stepping forward. Maeve looked from Tamsin to Calder and back. She whistled, long and low. "So you're the one he's been selling. Heard he cashed you in at the Blue Kestrel." Her voice was blunt, not unkind. "A man was there," Tamsin said. "Black coat, name of Deacon Pike. We think he's posted a warrant for me. A fake one." "Pike," Maeve spat, as if the name were a piece of rotten meat. "I know him. He's a bottom feeder who thinks he's a hawk. Hang on." She walked to a back room, and they heard her rummaging through stacks of paper. She returned with a poster. It was identical to the one Cyrus had found. "Wanted, Rosa Quinn, $50. Tamsin's blood ran cold. "That's it, the description. It's me." Maeve laid the poster on her main press table, under a bright gas lamp. She pulled a jeweler's loop from her apron pocket and bent close, examining the bottom of the page. "He's getting sloppy," Maeve said, her voice tight with professional disgust. "What?" Calder asked, moving closer. "The stamp." Maeve pointed with a long, inky finger. "The territorial seal from Larkspur. It's real. Hobbs stamp, no doubt. The little coward would sell his mother for $1. "Then it's legal," Tamsin said, her hope sinking. The stamp is real, Maeve said, holding up a finger. But the ink isn't. Look. She pushed the loop into Tamsin's hand. Look at the ink on the stamp. Then look at the ink of the text. Tamsin peered through the glass. The text, Rosa Quinn, Vagrancy, was a deep, solid black. The ink of the stamp, the official seal, was a fainter, purplish black. This is courthouse ink, Maeve said, tapping the stamp. It's standard issue, made with iron gall. Fades to this purple brown. The text. She dipped her finger in a can on her shelf and held it up. This is lampblack. Book press ink. You get it at any general store. She straightened up. Pike didn't get this from a judge. He printed this himself. Or had someone do it. Then he found a weak-willed clerk Hobb to put a real stamp on his fake paper. He's legalized a lie. Tamsin felt a rush of adrenaline. Sharp and clean. Can you prove it? To a judge, maybe. To the town, absolutely. Maeve grinned. A fierce, feral expression. This is my trade, girl, and I hate a man who does it badly. I need you to print something for me, Tamsin said, her voice finding the same command she'd used in the barn. What's that? A warning, a notice, telling the people of this territory that a man named Deacon Pike is carrying a fraudulent warrant for a woman named Rosa Quinn, telling them to be wary of false bounties. Sign it, a friend of the law. Maeve's grin widened. That's not just a warning. That's a declaration of war. He'll be run out of the territory on a rail if this gets out. That's the idea, Calder said. It'll cost you, Maeve said, already pulling out a block of fresh type. We'll pay. Calder said, I'll have 100 copies run by sundown, Maeve said, and my delivery boy will have them posted from here to Alder Mesa by sunup. Pike won't be able to buy a cup of coffee without someone spitting in it. The news, carried by Maeve's fast-riding delivery boy, spread like wildfire. A fake warrant was an insult to every citizen. It made a mockery of the law. And in a land with so little of it, that was a hanging offense. The news reached Deacon Pike just as he and Cyrus were camped at the mouth of the Mesquite Draw, preparing for their pre-dawn assault. A friendly stable hand in Larkspur Basin, paid by Deacon for information, had ridden hard to warn him. Deacon read Maeve's notice by the light of his small fire. His face, for the first time, showed a flicker of raw anger. He'd been outmaneuvered, outprinted. What is it? Cyrus asked, his new gun heavy on his hip, his courage high from the bourbon. The girl, Deacon said, his voice a low hiss. She's not a victim. She's a player. He crumpled the notice and threw it into the fire, watching it blacken and burn. His plan to walk in with the law on his side was gone. His reputation was, at this very moment, turning to ash all across the territory. He stood up, kicking dirt onto the fire, extinguishing it. We're not waiting for dawn, he said, his voice flat and cold as a grave marker. We go now. We take her tonight. The ride back from Brimstone Wash was fast and silent. The air, which had tasted of freedom on the way in, now felt charged, heavy as a thunderhead. Maeve's notice had bought them time, but they both knew it had also lit a fuse. Pike was not a man who would be shamed into leaving. He would be enraged into acting. He'll come tonight, Calder said, as they unsaddled the horses in the barn. The sun was a low, angry red, bleeding into the western hills. I know, Tamsin said. She wasn't just agreeing. She was stating a fact she felt in her bones. You said you wanted to fight with paper, Calder said, turning to her. You did that. Maeve's poster is a brilliant shot, but Pike isn't made of paper. When he comes, it will be with a gun. Then I need to be ready, she said. He nodded, a grim approval in his eyes. He walked to a long box in his tack room and took out a Winchester rifle. It was lighter than his own, the stock worn smooth. My mother's, he said. She could hit a running jackrabbit at 100 yards with it. He didn't take her to a normal range. He led her to a dry arroyo behind the barn, where the high dirt walls would catch the sound. He didn't set up man-shaped targets. He took 3 empty wooden bottles from a crate and set them on a log 50 yards away. I'm not teaching you to kill, Calder said, his voice low and serious as he handed her the rifle. It was heavy, but the balance was perfect. I'm not making you into a gunfighter. That's a dark road, and it doesn't have an end. He stood behind her, not touching her, but his presence was a solid wall. I'm teaching you how to make a man stop, how to make him think twice, how to buy yourself 3 seconds to get on your horse. That's all. The goal is to escape, not to win. Tamsin pressed the wooden stock to her shoulder. It felt foreign, powerful. Breathe, he commanded softly. Don't hold your breath. You'll shake. Breathe out and at the very bottom of the breath. When you're empty and still, that's when you squeeze. Don't pull. Squeeze. Let the gun surprise you. She aimed. The bottle swam in her vision. She remembered Cyrus, his hands shaking so badly he could barely pour a drink, let alone aim. She remembered the men at the line camp, their movements sloppy and violent. She breathed out, squeezed. The rifle bucked, the sound slamming against the arroyo walls. Dirt kicked up 5 feet to the left of the log. Again, he said. Don't think about the kick. Don't think about the noise. Just look at the bottle. See nothing else. She fired again and again. For an hour, she shot, loaded, and shot. The air filled with the sharp smell of sulfur. Her shoulder began to ache, a deep, blossoming bruise. She missed. She missed. She hit the log. And then, finally, as the sun dipped below the rim of the basin, she breathed out, found the stillness, and squeezed. The center bottle exploded into a spray of wooden splinters. She lowered the rifle, her arms trembling. Good, Calder said. It was the highest praise he could offer. That's enough. But the lesson wasn't over. He led her to the open area by the main corral. He uncoiled a long, thick lariat. Tamsin flinched. Her hand went to the blue silk at her neck. The sight of the rope, hanging in loops from his hand, brought back the cabin, the smell of hot iron, the raw, burning bite against her skin. Calder saw her expression. He didn't soften. He held the rope out to her. I know, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I know what this is to you. It's a chain. It's a noose. It's the thing that held you. He dropped the coils into her stiff, unwilling hands. Now it's going to be the thing that frees you. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Pike has a gun, he said. Cyrus has a gun. What if you don't? What if you're 10 feet away and your rifle is empty? A gun is useless if it's not in your hand. But a rope! He showed her how to build the loop, how to hold the coils, how to swing it. A slow, steady circle over her head, using her wrist, not her arm. It's not about strength, he said. It's about timing. You're not trying to pull a 2,000-pound bull. You're trying to trip a 180-pound man. You're trying to pull his gun from his hand. You're trying to tie a knot that will hold. He taught her a quick-release hitch. He taught her a bowline. He taught her how to throw. The rope sailing out. The loop landing flat. She practiced for another hour, her fears slowly giving way to a new kind of power. This was not the rope that bound her. This was a tool, like the key, like the saddle. She swung it, the loop circling, and let it fly. It landed perfectly around a fence post. She pulled it tight. Calder nodded. The rope that was tied around your throat, he said, his voice rough. You now used to tie your freedom fast. Don't ever forget that. Just as darkness was truly beginning to settle, they heard the sound of a hard-ridden horse, not at the gate, but coming fast, the way they had returned from Brimstone. Maeve Holliday appeared out of the twilight like a whirlwind, her red hair escaping its bun, her face flushed with grim purpose. She didn't dismount. I don't have long, she panted, her horse blowing hard. Pike's notice lit a fire, just like we wanted, but it shook something loose. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it out to Tamsin. My delivery boy. He stopped at the Blue Kestrel in Alder Mesa to post the notice. Silas, the owner, got drunk and talkative, afraid. He was worried about being an accomplice to Pike's fraud, so he showed my boy this. Tamsin took the paper. It was a copy of a liquor bill. A long, running tab for Cyrus Rowe, kept in Silas's spidery handwriting. It listed bottles of rye, whiskey, bourbon, and at the very bottom, a single, terrifying entry. Debt cleared in full. Payment $100. Collateral T, Rowe, sister, full transfer. It wasn't a bill of sale. It was worse. It was a transaction, a piece of accounting. It was Cyrus's signature, shaky and vain, scrawled at the bottom, accepting the terms. He hadn't just sold her in a drunken fit. He had signed her away, like a horse or a side of bacon, to cover his tab. "That's his signature, isn't it?" Maeve asked, her voice gentle. "Yes," Tamsin said. Her voice was ice. All the fear, all the trembling, was gone. It had been burned away, leaving something hard and cold and clear. "This is the proof. Elias Davil," Maeve said quickly. "The circuit judge. He's in Larkspur Basin tonight. He's holding court in the morning. If this and your story get to him before Pike does, Pike's warrant won't just be voided. It'll be an arrest order for him." "How do we get it to him?" Calder asked, stepping forward. "We can't leave the ranch undefended." "You don't," Maeve said. "I'm riding there now. I'll get there by 3 in the morning. But I need more than this bill. I need her story. Signed. Witnessed. An affidavit." Tamsin was already moving. "Calder, light the lamp in the kitchen." She ran inside. She didn't weep. She didn't rage. She sat at the kitchen table, took the pen and ink Calder kept for his ledgers, and she began to write. She wrote with a steady, furious hand. "My name is Tamsin Rowe. I am not Rosa Quinn. I am the sister of Cyrus Rowe." She told the story, the line camp, the rope, the sale at the saloon. She attached the liquor bill as evidence. She wrote of Pike's fake warrant. She wrote, "Finally, I am not property. I am a citizen. And I demand the law protect me from the man who sold me, and the man who hunts me." She signed it. Tamsin Rowe. Calder signed as a witness. Maeve Holliday signed as a witness. Tamsin folded the pages and handed them to Maeve. "Ride fast," she said, "like the devil himself is chasing me." Maeve promised. She tucked the document deep into her coat. "Now, you two, you hold this ranch. Don't just hold it. Keep it. Davil will be here by dawn, and he'll bring the law. Just last until dawn." Maeve wheeled her horse and disappeared into the night, a messenger of ink and justice. Calder and Tamsin were alone. The ranch was silent. "He'll come from the north," Calder said, thinking of the hoofprint. "But Pike knows about the bells. He's patient. He'll expect us to be watching the trails. What if he brings trackers?" Tamsin thought of Pike's cold, assessing eyes. "Dogs," she said. "He looks like a man who would use dogs." "The mesquite draw," Calder said, a new urgency in his voice. Cyrus knows that back trail. He'd sell it to Pike. Then we blind it." Tamsin said they worked for the next hour in the dark. They didn't use lanterns. They took a bucket of pine resin from the barn sticky, sharp-smelling stuff used for waterproofing. They moved like ghosts up the ridge, near the goat trail Cyrus knew, and they smeared the resin thick over the rocks, the brush, the trail itself. The powerful, clean smell of pine would overwhelm any other scent, confusing a dog's nose, making them blind. As they worked their way back down, Tamsin stopped by the corral. The foal, Juniper, was sleeping, curled up against her mother. Tamsin reached over the fence and, with her small knife, carefully cut a tiny snippet of hair from the foal's mane. She sat on the porch, her fingers twisting the soft hair, braiding it, tying it with a piece of thread. Calder came out, loading the Winchester. "What's that?" She held it out, a tiny, rough braid, a little charm. "It's from Juniper," she said. "So you remember to come back." His large, calloused hand closed over the tiny charm. He looked at her, his face shadowed, and for a second, she thought he would say something. Instead, he just nodded, his throat working, and tucked the charm deep into his shirt pocket. "The flares," he said, his voice gruff. "In the feed store, hidden in a dry box, were railroad signal flares." "If it goes bad," Calder said, his voice all business, If there are more than we can handle, or if one of us is hit 3 flares, one after another, it means run. Run for the high rocks and don't look back." "And if the plan works?" Tamsin asked. "1 flare," he said. "1 bright red flare. That means attack. It means the trap is sprung, and we're moving in." They went back to the house. The rifle was on the table. The lariat was coiled by the door. The house was dark. They waited. The moon rose, that same pale crescent, and the basin was washed in silver black. The wind whispered. A barn owl hooted, a lonely hunting sound. Then tink, it was tiny, faint, but unmistakable. Not the gate bell. It was the bell on the path to the south. Calder and Tamsin looked at each other in the dark. A diversion. Then, from the north, a sound that wasn't the wind, the soft crunch of a boot on gravel, a dry twig snapping. Then tee-ink. The bell on the high path, the one near the mesquite draw. Pike was here, and Cyrus. Calder put his hand on the door latch. Tamsin picked up the lariat, its coils feeling balanced and familiar in her hand. He looked at her, no words, just a single, sharp nod. "The plan is on." She nodded back. "We take them alive, outside, in the shadows 50 yards from the barn." Deacon Pike raised his hand, stopping Cyrus. He'd heard the bell. He cursed his own arrogance. He'd seen the wire, but in the dark. He'd missed it. "They know we're here," Pike hissed. "So what?" Cyrus slurred, his courage high from the bourbon Deacon had given him. "There's 2 of them. 2 of us. Let's just go in. I'll shoot the bastard. You grab the girl." "No," Pike said, his eyes scanning the dark barn. The trap was sprung, but he didn't know which trap. He thought he was the hunter. "They're expecting us at the house. They're watching the front. You're useless in a fair fight. Go, circle around the back of the barn. Make a noise. Draw them out. When they come out to see, I'll be waiting. Go in the dark. What about... Go!" Pike shoved him. Cyrus, clutching his new, unfired gun, stumbled off into the shadows, making a wide loop toward the back of the barn, just as he'd been told. Pike smiled. He settled behind a water trough, his own pistol drawn, his eyes fixed on the ranch house door. He didn't see the thin, dark line of rope, stretched taut 6 inches off the ground, right in the path he'd sent Cyrus. He didn't see the heavy, iron-weighted wolf net rigged to a tree branch above, pulled tight and ready. He just waited, a predator about to be undone by his own bait. It wasn't night, but the world was holding its breath. The sun had set, but the darkness was a visible, heavy thing, a bruised purple that pressed down on the basin. The air was dead calm, hot and thick, clinging to the skin. You could smell the dust hanging in the stillness, and something else, the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. High above the black spine of Cinder Butte, silent, flickering veins of heat lightning pulsed inside the clouds, a storm winding itself up for the attack. On the ranch, every sound was magnified. The soft stamp of a horse in the corral, the creak of a floorboard in the house. The bells Calder had strung on the perimeter wires were utterly silent, and the silence was louder than any alarm. The training was done. The weapons were ready. The affidavit was on its way. All that was left was the waiting, and the waiting was its own kind of war. The first break in the tension was a sound, high and terrified. From the barn, a sharp, panicked whinny. Juniper. Tamsin was moving before her mind had even formed the thought. The premature foal, sensitive as a raw nerve, was reacting to the sudden, suffocating drop in air pressure. She threw open the kitchen door and ran across the yard, her boots sinking into the deep, dry dust. Calder was a half-step behind her. Grabbing a lantern as he went, she pushed open the heavy barn door. The air inside was stifling, thick with the smell of hay and animal fear. In the back stall, the little Palomino foal was trembling, its long legs knocking, its eyes wide and white. The mare, its mother, was pacing, snorting and kicking at the stall wall. "It's the air, it's just the pressure," Tamsin said, as much to Calder as to the animals. Her voice was low and steady, the voice she had used to calm the foal at its birth. She slipped the latch and entered the stall, moving without a flicker of hesitation, her hands out and low. "Easy now, little one, easy. It's just the sky getting ready to shout. It's nothing to fear." She reached the foal, putting her arms around its neck, pressing her own body against its shaking one, murmuring quiet, meaningless comforts. "You're safe. We're in the wood. We're safe in here." As the words left her mouth, the wind hit. It did not come as a gust. It came as a solid, invisible fist, slamming into the basin from the high ridges. The entire barn, a structure of thick, seasoned timber, groaned under the impact. The massive double doors Calder had just followed her through were torn from his grip and flung wide, crashing against the exterior walls with the sound of cannon fire. A cyclone of dust, straw, and dried leaves exploded into the barn, plunging the lantern-lit space into a sudden, chaotic blindness. The horses screamed. "The stall! Hold the foal!" Calder roared, his voice ripped away by the wind. He was already fighting his way back to the opening, a dark shape against the churning gray chaos. He grabbed the edge of one of the massive doors, and the wind instantly tried to snatch him from the ground. He planted his boots, his muscles straining, and used his entire weight as ballast, dragging the heavy plank door back, inch by inch, against the shrieking force. He wrestled the heavy wooden crossbar into its iron brackets. The thud was a note of victory. He turned to the second door, the wind howling through the gap, and fought it, too. Finally slamming it shut, the sound of the world changed. The deafening roar was instantly muffled, replaced by a high, whistling shriek. And then the rain. It was not a gentle prairie shower. It was a deluge, a solid sheet of water that hit the shingled roof with a sudden, violent, hammering roar. It sounded like 1,000 heavy drums, a frantic, angry rhythm that drowned out the wind, the horses, and even thought itself. In the stall, Tamsin held the trembling foal until its shivers subsided, the animal's panic giving way to the steady, comforting presence. The mare, too, settled, nuzzling Tamsin's shoulder, reassured by the small circle of calm. Calder, his chest heaving, slid down the wall by the door he had just barred. He was soaked with sweat and breathless from the fight. He let his head fall back against the wood, the vibration of the storm rattling his bones, the waiting, the vigilance, and now this. The exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. Tamsin, satisfied the foal was safe, stroked its mane one last time and slipped quietly from the stall. The barn was a golden, noisy fortress. The single lantern, hanging from a central beam, cast a small circle of light, leaving the high eaves and deep corners in shadow. The rain on the roof was a deafening, constant, primal sound. She walked to where Calder sat, his eyes closed. She didn't sit beside him. She sank to the floor, onto a pile of clean hay. A few feet away, her back against the same wall. She drew her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. For a long time, they just sat, they listened. The rain was a wall, separating them from the world. It was washing away the tracks. It was cleansing the air. It was a violent, protective baptism. In that moment, it felt as if they were the only two people in the entire storm-racked territory. Calder opened his eyes. He wasn't looking at her, but at his own hands, resting on his knees. They were broad, scarred. The knuckles cracked from dry air and hard work. The hands that had thrown a fortune in gold onto a bar. The hands that had taught her to shoot. Tamsin watched him. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the weariness in the set of his jaw. He was a man holding a fortress, not just for himself, but now for her. He had taken on her danger, made it his. He had paid for her. Yes, but he had not bought her. He had ransomed her. Her hand, the one that had held the iron key all that first night, moved. It was the slowest, most deliberate motion. She uncurled her fingers and reached across the small, shadowed space between them. She did not try to hold his hand. She did not caress it. She simply laid her hand, palm down, on the back of his. It was a gesture of profound, terrifying honesty. It was not a request. It was permission. A statement of fact. I'm here. I'm not afraid of you. I see you. His hand was hot and rough against her cool skin. He went utterly still. A long second passed. Then two. Tamsin felt her heart hammer in her throat. She had misread everything. She had broken the truce of their quiet companionship. Then, slowly, he turned his hand over, his fingers sliding between hers, his palm finding her palm. He didn't grip, he didn't pull, he simply enfolded her hand in his. His thumb brushed once, a light, dry stroke, over her knuckles. It was an answer. And I see you. The rain hammered the roof, a symphony of chaos. The lantern flame danced, casting their shadows, now joined by their hands, long and dark against the wooden wall. They stood. They moved as one, slowly, as if the air were thick. They turned to face each other, their hands still locked together. The warm, yellow light was kind. It softened the hard lines of his face, making his gray eyes dark and deep. It found the gold threads in her hair and illuminated the rich, deep blue of the silk scarf at her throat. I don't want to be owned, she whispered. Her voice was thin, almost lost in the storm. It was the last great fear, the one that sat beneath all the others. Not by him, not by anyone. She looked down at their joined hands. But I want to choose. He understood completely. It was the creed he had built his entire life upon. The man who lived behind a chained gate on Cinder Butte. The man who chose his own solitude. So do I, Tamsin, he answered. His voice was a low, rough sound, like dry wood and gravel. So do I. He didn't pull her. He let go of her hand, only to lift his own, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. He laid his palm against her cheek. His skin was calloused, warm. His thumb rested just at the corner of her mouth. It was a touch of immense, quiet reverence. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch. A small, trusting movement, her eyes fluttering closed. He lowered his head. The first kiss was not a taking. It was a question. It was tentative, impossibly gentle. A soft, warm pressure of his lips against hers. It was long and deep and breathless. It was a pause in the storm. It tasted of the rain and the dust, and it was a quiet, staggering relief. His other arm came around her, his hand settling on the small of her back, not pulling her, just holding her. Her free hand, the one he had held, came up to rest on his chest, her fingers curling over the hard muscle, right where she knew the tiny braid of Juniper's hair was tucked in his pocket. There was no urgency, no desperate grab. It was the slowest dance in the world. His fingers moved from her cheek, tracing the line of her jaw, then drifting to the back of her neck. His hand spread wide over her back, a solid, warm pressure through the thin cotton of her shirt. It was a touch that said, "You are here, you are solid, you are safe." She pulled back, just an inch, just enough to breathe, and then she moved. Tamsin stepped into him, turning her head and pressing her forehead against the warm, strong column of his throat. She rested there, her body lightly pressed against his, and just breathed. She breathed in the scent of him: clean soap, leather, wool, and the faint, sharp tang of the pine resin from their work on the ridge. She closed her eyes, and she could feel it, the steady, powerful thump, thump, thump of his heart against her skin. Calder's arms closed around her, holding her fully. He bent his head, resting his cheek against her hair. He felt the small, final tremor that ran through her, the last echo of a lifetime of fear being pushed out. This was not a moment of passion. It was a moment of ballast. Two people, battered and isolated, holding each other up against the noise of the world. It was a promise. It was an oath, made without a single word, sealed in the storm. The rain began to soften. The violent, hammering assault on the roof eased into a steady, heavy drumming. "The house is warm," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her hair. She nodded against his throat, not wanting to move. He loosened his embrace. She stepped back, though her hand found his again, her fingers lacing with his. He kept her hand as he reached up, lifted the hot lantern from its hook, and blew out the flame. The barn was plunged into a deep, comfortable dark, the only light a pale gray smear from the high window. The sound of the rain was a comfort now, a lullaby. He led her, their hands locked, out of the barn. The yard was a sea of mud, the air cold and sharp and washed clean. They didn't run, they walked through the rain, their joined hands the one, warm, fixed point in the night, in the kitchen. The fire in the stove had burned down to a deep bed of glowing red embers, casting a faint, warm light. His rifle and the lariat were propped by the door. Ready? His wet duster fell to its peg. Her damp outer shirt, heavy with rain, dropped to the back of a chair. The kitchen was warm, quiet, and absolutely safe. He turned to her in the dim, red glow. Their hands, still joined, separated, only to come back together, fingers weaving palm to palm, a perfect, sure fit. His other hand came up, cupping her jaw. Her hand found his waist, pulling him, just slightly, closer. Their second kiss was not like the first. It was not a question. It was the answer. It was deep, and sure, and certain. It was the heat of the fire against the cold of the rain. It was the promise of the locked loft door, and the shared training, and the fight they knew was coming. It was the choice she had demanded, and the choice he had made. The camera of the mind does not, and should not, follow. It stops, focusing on their two hands, clasped tight, knuckles white, holding on before the embers fade, and the room goes to black. Morning. The storm was gone. The world was scoured, sharp and painfully bright. The sunlight that flooded the kitchen was cold and clear. Tamsin was at the stove, the coffee pot bubbling. Calder stood by the open door, the Winchester in his grip, scanning the basin. The mud in the yard was already beginning to steam. She turned. In her hand was a single piece of cornbread, left from 2 nights before. She had split it in 2. She held the plate out to him. He turned, took his half. They ate the dry, simple bread, sharing the last of their food, their last moment of peace. But the air between them was wholly new. The silence was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of partners. They looked at each other, their eyes meeting over the rim of their coffee mugs. It was a clear, unbroken gaze. They were not a rancher and his refugee. They were 2 soldiers, ready for the line. Maeve will be in Larkspur, he said. She will, Tamsin said, and Judge Dovell will come. We just have to hold them off. Hold the ranch until he gets here. We will. Calder nodded once. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his eyes scanning the ridges. Everything was still, bright and clean, but out there, in the wet sagebrush, hidden from view. Deacon Pike and Cyrus Rowe were also greeting the morning. They, too, had ridden out the storm, and on the main path, the one that ran from the porch to the barn, the path one of them would have to take. Deacon had just finished his work, buried just beneath the slick, wet mud. The heavy saw-toothed jaws of a steel wolf trap lay open, waiting. Their morning greeting was set. Judge Elias Dovell did not believe in sleeping on injustice. He was a man of hard benches and harder truths, and he'd been a circuit judge in the territory for 20 years. He'd seen every kind of human failing, but the one he despised most was the twisting of his own authority. Maeve Holliday, mud-spattered, exhausted, and running on pure, uncut fury, had arrived at his chambers in Larkspur Basin at 3:30 in the morning. She hadn't knocked. She'd hammered on the door until he opened it. A shotgun in his hand. Now, under the low light of a single oil lamp, he'd read it all. Tamsin Rowe's affidavit, her handwriting clear and steady, every word a small, cold nail. He'd seen the copy of the liquor bill from the Blue Kestrel. Collateral T, Rowe, sister. His jaw had tightened until a muscle jumped, but it was the poster that sealed it. Lampblack, Maeve said, pointing, her finger as sharp as a typesetter's tool. He printed the text himself. Then he got Hobb, that sniveling coward in the clerk's office, to put a real territorial stamp on it. He used your authority, judge, to legalize a kidnapping." Dovel's eyes, the color of gunmetal, were flat and cold. He folded the papers. He didn't just see a crime against a woman. He saw an insurrection against the law itself. "Marshal," he'd barked to the man sleeping on a cot in the outer office. "Get up. Get 2 deputies. We ride to Hollow Spur. We ride now." Dawn at the ranch was painfully beautiful. The storm had washed the air clean, and the world smelled of wet sage and pine. Every rock, every blade of grass, seemed etched against the bright, cold sky. Calder stood on the porch, the rifle in his hands, his eyes scanning the basin. Tamsin stood beside him, the empty lariat coiled at her feet. They had not slept. The waiting was a high, thin wire pulled taut. "He's out there," Calder said. "He and Cyrus. They waited out the storm. They're just waiting." Tamsin looked east, toward a neighboring ridge, miles away. "Nettie Quayle," she said, her voice quiet. "She lives over that rise. Her husband passed 3 years ago. She runs her ranch with her 2 sons. She stopped me on the trail once, when I was riding for supplies. She saw the bruise Cyrus had left." Tamsin touched the blue silk scarf at her neck. "She told me, a woman alone out here needs more than a strong horse. She needs witnesses. She said if I ever needed someone to stand with me, to hang a blue cloth from my line, and she'd come. No questions." Calder watched her. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the warring of the personal and the necessary. That scarf was the first beautiful thing she'd been given, a symbol of her new life. She untied it. The silk felt cool and light in her hands. She walked, her back straight, to the high barn door. She tied the scarf, a brilliant slash of twilight blue, to the heavy iron latch in the sharp, new morning. It was as bright and clear as a signal flare. "Now, the trap," Calder said, his voice all business. He knew they were being watched. Pike was a hunter. He would be patient. But Maeve's notice had made him desperate. He had to be drawn in, disarmed, and held. A gunfight was a loss, even if they won. Calder moved to the side of the house, to the soft mud near the woodshed. He took a heavy horseshoe from his pocket. He didn't make tracks toward the house. He made them away from it. Deep, frantic prints, as if someone had run from the porch in the dark and slipped. He made them lead, in a desperate, hurried line, straight to the old, dry well that sat in the middle of the yard. The well was a 30-foot drop, stone-lined and dark, a perfect place to hide, a perfect place to set a trap. He took the lariat from Tamsin. He uncoiled it. He didn't lay it on the ground. He braced himself against the inside lip of the well, reached down into the darkness, and fixed the rope. The loop, wide and open, was hidden just below the stone rim, a snare not for a foot, but for an arm. He tied the end fast to the base of the heavy, immovable winch post. "It's set," he said, returning to the porch. "Now we show him the bait." He stood, rifle in hand. Tamsin stood beside him. They looked out, 2 figures, seemingly unaware, waiting for a dawn that had already come, from a high cluster of manzanita on the ridge. Deacon Pike watched them through his spyglass. The storm had been a misery, but it had also washed the slate clean. He saw Calder. He saw the woman. And yes, he saw the tracks in the mud, leading from the house. He smiled. His prey was stupid. One of them had tried to make a run for it in the storm and hidden in the well. "What is it?" Cyrus whispered. He was pale, his hands shaking, his new gun feeling heavy and useless. "The girl." Pike lied. "She's in the well. The rancher is standing guard. He's expecting us to come for the house, but his prize is in the open." He collapsed his spyglass. "You, stay here. Make noise if I signal. I'm ending this." Pike moved like a shadow, low and fast, his black coat blending with the wet earth. He didn't approach from the front. He circled wide, using the barn as cover, until he was just 20 yards from the well, the house at his back. He saw Calder turn his head, as if listening for something in the hills. Pike took the opening. He charged from behind the barn. his pistol already in his hand, his face set in a mask of cold triumph. He would have the woman. He would deal with the rancher. And he would be gone before the law even smelled his trail. He reached the well. "Now, Rosa!" he hissed, and thrust his gun arm over the edge, ready to fire down into the darkness, to flush her out. The world yanked him off his feet. The lariat loop, which he had never seen, snapped tight around his wrist and gun hand. His forward momentum did the rest. The rope went taut, jerking his arm with the force of a full-grown steer. His shoulder screamed in its socket. His fingers flew open in pure, agonizing reflex. His Navy Colt, the symbol of his authority, flew from his grasp. It vanished into the black, clattering against the stone walls, once, twice before a final, sickening thud echoed up from the bottom. He was disarmed. He spun, his hand throbbing, his mind reeling, and froze. Calder hadn't moved from the porch, and Tamsin Rowe was walking toward him. She had stepped off the porch as he charged, and she was now 10 yards away, the Winchester rifle resting lightly in her hands. It was not at her hip. It was leveled, steady as a rock, aimed directly at the center of his chest. Her eyes were as cold as the morning. "You're not going anywhere, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent yard, not without a real warrant. "You!" Pike was speechless. He'd been played. He looked from her to Calder, to his empty, aching hand. "She's mine." The roar came from the side. Cyrus. He hadn't stayed put, driven by a bourbon-fueled rage and the sight of his property holding a gun. He'd crept closer. He burst from behind the woodshed, his new pistol waving wildly. He wasn't aiming at Pike. He was aiming at her. He lunged, his free hand grabbing for the barrel of her rifle. "You're coming with me! Get your hands off her, Cyrus Rowe!" The voice was like a whip crack, sharp, old, and full of iron. Cyrus froze. Everyone froze. Standing at the main gate, her face grim, was Nettie Quayle. She wasn't alone. Flanking her were her 2 sons, tall, grim-faced young men, both holding 12-gauge shotguns, both aimed not at Cyrus, but at Pike. Nettie held up a piece of paper, flapping it in the air. It was one of Maeve's posters. "We read all about your Rosa Quinn. Mister," she snapped. "We don't take kindly to liars and thieves in this basin." The yard was a tableau of confrontation, Tamsin steady. Cyrus caught, Pike disarmed. Nettie and her sons a line of unmovable justice. Into this silence came a new sound, the heavy, rhythmic pounding of fast-ridden horses. A column of riders crested the ridge, not in a charge, but at a hard, official canter. At their lead was Judge Elias Dovell, his face a mask of granite. Beside him, mud-spattered but sitting tall in her saddle, was Maeve Holliday. 2 armed marshals fanned out behind them. They reined in, their horses breathing hard. Judge Dovell took in the entire scene in one sweeping glance. The lariat tied to the well, Pike clutching his wrist, Cyrus frozen mid-lunge, Tamsin holding the rifle. "In the name of the territorial court," Dovell's voice boomed, cutting the air. "What is the meaning of this?" Pike, seeing the law, saw his one chance. He shoved his throbbing hand into his coat. "Judge, thank God, I'm making a lawful arrest. This woman," he pointed a shaking finger at Tamsin, "is a fugitive. Rosa Quinn. I have the warrant." He pulled out his fake, ink-smeared poster. "Give it to me," Dovell ordered, dismounting. He walked to Pike, snatched the paper from his hand. He pulled a small, brass-bound magnifying glass from his vest pocket. The entire yard held its breath. Dovell examined the stamp. He examined the text. He looked up, his eyes finding Maeve. "Lampblack ink," he said. It was not a question. It was a verdict. "And this, Your Honor." Maeve said. She dismounted and strode forward, handing him the folded liquor bill from the blue kestrel. Dovell unfolded it. He read the last line aloud, his voice like rolling thunder. "Debt cleared in full. Payment $100. Collateral T. Rowe, sister. Full transfer. Signed, Cyrus Rowe." Nettie Quayle gasped. A sharp angry sound. "He sold her." The judge's gaze settled on Cyrus, who was visibly shaking, the bourbon sweat beading on his face. "Cyrus Rowe, is this your signature?" It was just a tab. Your Honor, a joke, I was drunk. Tamsin Rowe." The judge turned, his voice softening only a fraction. "Your testimony." Tamsin lowered the rifle. She didn't drop it. She held it at her side. She stood tall, her feet planted in the mud of the yard she had fought for. The blue scarf, her signal, her sacrifice, fluttered on the barn door behind her, a flag of freedom. She spoke. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. Her words were clear and sharp as chipped stone. She told them about the line camp. She told them about the rope and the cold iron. She told them about the auction block in the blue kestrel. She finished, her eyes locked on the judge. "He sold me. This man hunted me. I am not merchandise. I am Tamsin Rowe." Judge Doval looked at her for a long, silent moment. He looked at Pike, who was white with rage. He looked at Cyrus, who was simply white with terror. He walked back to his horse, took his heavy judicial ledger from his saddlebag, and slapped it shut. The sound was as final and absolute as a gunshot. "Marshal," he commanded, "arrest Deacon Pike for fraudulent use of a territorial seal, conspiracy, and attempted kidnap by false warrant. He will stand trial in my court." He turned. "Marshal, arrest Cyrus Rowe for the trafficking and sale of a human being under territorial law." The marshals moved in, efficient and grim. Irons clicked shut over Pike's throbbing wrist. A second pair closed on Cyrus, who finally seemed to collapse, his bluster gone. As the men were being led to the horses, a long, slow wind moved down from Cinder Butte. It rustled the leaves of the tall eucalyptus trees by the creek, and it caught the blue silk scarf on the barn door, making it dance. It was the first time the wind in this basin had not sounded like a threat. It sounded, Tamsin thought, like a long, slow exhale. Maeve Holliday stepped up beside Tamsin. Nettie Quayle came to her other side. Nettie looked at the two marshals leading the prisoners away. Then she slowly, deliberately, began to clap. Her rough, calloused hands made a solid, steady sound in the quiet yard. Her sons, lowering their shotguns, joined in. Maeve added hers. It was not a cheer. It was the sound of truth, hard-won and final, echoing in the clean morning air. The applause, thin and scattered in the vastness of the basin, had just begun to die. Judge Doval was giving orders to his marshals, securing the prisoners. It was a moment of sharp, cold release, the feeling of a fever that had just broken. Calder was the first to see it. His head snapped up, his gaze fixed on the southern ridge, the main trail from Alder Mesa. He didn't say a word, but his body went rigid. Tamsin followed his look. A line of riders, not 2 or 3, a dozen, maybe 15, coming hard, a disorganized, angry rabble, kicking up plumes of mud. They were already in the basin, thundering past the outer gate, a wave of chaos about to break. As they got closer, Tamsin could see the red bandanas pulled up over their noses. "Who?" Maeve breathed, her hand flying to her throat. "Rillbone Gulch!" Nettie Quayle spat, her voice hardening. "Cyrus's drinking friends." The bottom of the barrel. Cyrus, standing in irons between the two marshals, looked up. A wild, desperate grin split his face. "That's right, my friends. They've come for me. You'll all be sorry now." The lead rider, a big man on a piebald horse, fired his pistol into the air. "Give us Cyrus. Give us the bounty hunter, or we'll burn this place to the ground." They were a mob, drunk on liquor and their own numbers, whipped into a frenzy at the thought of their friend being taken by the law. Judge Doval held up his hand. "This is an official court action. Disperse at once, or you will face federal charges." The leader just laughed and fired again, the bullet kicking up mud 20 feet from the judge's horse. "We don't care about your court. Old man, give 'em up." The two marshals drew their sidearms, moving to flank the judge, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Calder turned, his face a mask of cold decision. He looked at Tamsin, "Remember the signal," he said, low and fast. He ran, not for his rifle, but for the side of the house. Grabbing a signal flare from the dry box on the porch, he struck the cap, and it lit with a searing, hissing whoosh. One flare. He didn't throw it. He held it high, a single, brilliant, red-hot star that burned against the clean morning sky. The attack signal. The mob, confused by the sudden light, reined in for a half-second, their horses dancing nervously. "What in the leader began. He never finished the thought. The signal wasn't for Tamsin. It was for everyone. Calder dropped the flare and sprinted, not to the house, but to the main corral. It was the large holding pen, and in it, panicked by the shouting and the gunfire, were 50 head of Calder's toughest, half-wild steers. He didn't just open the gate. He grabbed the long, iron pin that held the 3 main rails in place, wrenched it free, and with a roar, kicked the bottom rail. The entire side of the corral fell. For one long second, there was silence. Then, a new sound. A low, deep, earth-shaking rumble. The cattle, seeing the opening, surged. It was not a stampede. It was an explosion. A living wall of muscle, horn, and terror, charging directly into the flank of the attacker's line. The Rillbone Gulch gang, focused on the house, had no time to react. The wave of steers, bellowing and wild-eyed, slammed into them. Horses screamed and reared, their riders firing blindly into the air. The piebald horse of the leader was lifted clear off its feet, tossed aside like a toy. Men were unseated, thrown into the deep, churning mud, their guns flying from their hands. The organized line of riders dissolved instantly into a panicking, screaming, muddy chaos. It was the most brilliant, brutal, and bloodless cavalry charge the territory had ever seen. But the plan was not just the stampede. It was the counterattack. As the cattle surged, Tamsin was already moving. She had seen the red flare. She hadn't run for the house. She'd run for the barn. She grabbed Mistral's reins, threw herself onto the gray mare's bare back, and kicked her into a gallop. She burst from the barn, not as a victim, but as a rider. She had the lariat, her lariat, coiled in her hand. She saw the leader, the big man in the mud, climbing to his feet, pulling his pistol from the muck. She swung the rope. Once, twice, the loop, wide and perfect, sang in the air. It shot out, landing perfectly over his head and shoulders, pinning his gun arm to his side. Tamsin didn't stop. She veered Mistral hard, pulling the rope taut. The man was jerked from his feet like a calf, dragged face first through the mud, and left, trussed and sputtering, at the feet of Judge Duvall's horse. At the same instant, from the porch, came a new assault. "Eat this, you animals!" Nettie Quayle roared. She had run to the woodshed and emerged not with a gun, but with a heavy canvas sack. It was powdered lime, used for whitewashing the barn. With a grunt, she threw the bag into the middle of 2 riders who were trying to control their panicked horses. The bag burst, and a cloud of fine, white powder enveloped them. The screams were immediate and terrible. The men dropped their guns, their hands flying to their faces. "My eyes, I can't see, I'm blind." They fell from their saddles, rolling on the ground in agony, completely out of the fight. "And slip on this," Maeve Holliday shouted. She was not a fighter, she was a printer, but she saw the problem. 3 riders, still mounted, were trying to rally on the porch steps to get to the judge. Maeve grabbed the heavy oak brine barrel used for curing hides, a barrel full of cold, salty water. With a strength born of fury, she heaved it over. The barrel crashed onto its side, and 50 gallons of slick, icy salt water sluiced over the wooden steps, turning the mud-slicked wood into a sheet of ice. The first horse hit the steps, its iron-shod hooves finding no purchase. It went down in a heap, legs flailing, sending its rider crashing head-first into the porch rail. The other 2 horses collided, slipped, and fell, their riders tumbling, their rifles and pistols clattering uselessly onto the boards. It was a total, tactical rout. In the chaos, no one was watching the prisoners. Deacon Pike, his hands cuffed behind him, had watched the entire battle with a cold, assessing fury. He saw his chance. One of the fallen riders from the porch had dropped his pistol, but his knife, a long skinning blade, had skittered from its sheath and lay glistening in the mud. Just 6 feet away, Pike was not a man to be held, cuffed or not. He was a snake. He fell, as if stumbling, onto his side. He began to roll, his body inching, crab-like, across the mud toward the fallen knife. A shadow fell over him. He looked up. Tamsin. She was off her horse, her face streaked with mud, her eyes blazing. She wasn't holding the rifle. She wasn't holding the rope. She was holding a long-handled shovel from the feed shed. Pike grinned, his lips pulling back from his teeth. "You going to shoot me, girl, in front of the judge?" He was 3 feet from the knife. Tamsin didn't speak. She didn't raise the shovel to strike him. She reversed it, with a short, sharp, decisive thwack. She slammed the thick wooden handle of the shovel onto the back of his cuffed hands. Pike screamed, a high, thin sound, as a jolt of pure agony shot up his arms. He recoiled, his hands instinctively pulling back from the knife. With a second, casual motion, Tamsin hooked the blade of the shovel under the knife and flicked it, sending the weapon spinning 20 feet away into the deepest part of the mud. "No," she said, her voice shaking but full of ice. "I'm not." It was over. The Rillbone Gulch gang was a broken, muddy, moaning heap, moaning. Some were roped, some were blind. Most were unhorsed and surrounded by the few remaining angry steers. Calder, who had watched the entire fight from the corral, now stepped out. He raised his Winchester and fired one single, deafening shot straight into the air. The boom was huge, echoing off Cinder Butte and rolling back over the basin like a peal of thunder. Every man still standing, every man on the ground, froze. The sound was a full stop. It was the voice of the man who owned this valley, and it was a final warning. Into the ringing silence, Judge Elias Dovell raised a small, silver whistle to his lips and blew 3 sharp, piercing blasts. For a moment, nothing. Then, from the southern ridge, an answering whistle. And another. The Alder Mesa Patrol, called as backup, was here. The remaining uninjured riders saw them 6 more armed men, silhouetted against the sky. They were trapped, outsmarted, outfought, and the law was on all sides. The remaining riders threw their guns into the mud, their hands shooting into the air. "Don't shoot! We give, we give!" They scrambled for their horses, grabbing the reins of their panicked mounts, pulling their blinded friends up. They left the leader, still roped. They left the men on the porch, and they left Cyrus. They kicked their horses into a desperate, sloppy retreat, fleeing back up the trail, a defeated, humiliated mob. The yard was a ruin. It was a sea of mud, churned by cattle, littered with dropped guns, hats, and the entire spilled contents of the brine barrel. The air smelled of sulfur, sweat, pine, and the damp, raw scent of victory. Judge Dovell looked around, his face grim. He looked at the disarmed men, the roped leader, the 2 crying in the mud, clutching their eyes. "Nettie," he sighed. "Get a bucket of clean water. For their eyes, Maeve. See if those men broke their necks." He looked at Calder, then at Tamsin. A slow, almost imperceptible look of approval passed over his face. "A singular defense, Mr. Wynne. Singular." Tamsin walked past him, her legs feeling weak. She was covered in mud. Her hair was falling, and her hands ached. She walked to the barn. Her blue scarf, her signal, had been torn from the latch, trampled into the mud by the stampede. She bent and picked it up. It was ruined, ripped, filthy, and stained. She didn't care. She wiped the worst of the mud from it on her trousers. She walked to Mistral, who stood patiently, her sides heaving. Tamsin ran a hand down the mare's strong, damp neck. Then, with a gesture as deliberate as a signature, she tied the ruined, muddy, beautiful blue scarf around Mistral's bridle, just below the ear. It was not a flag of surrender. It was not a plea for help. It was her banner, a battle standard. And it was here to stay. The yard was a ruin, a churned sea of mud, iron, and rope. The Alder Mesa Patrol, arriving to a victory they hadn't fought for, were grim-faced and efficient, helping the 2 marshals secure the prisoners. The leader of the Rillbone Gulch gang, His arm, broken from Tamsin's lariat, was being tied to his own saddle. The two men Nettie had blinded were whimpering, their eyes being washed out with bucket water. Judge Dovell, his face like a granite cliff, was making notes in his ledger. Maeve was fashioning a crude sling for one of Nettie's sons, who had taken a fall. Calder, his rifle finally at rest, stood by the porch, his eyes on Tamsin. She was standing alone, her back to the house, near Mistral. She was covered in mud. Her hair was a wild tangle, but her spine was straight. She was watching the two men at the center of it all, Deacon Pike and her brother, Cyrus. A marshal grabbed Cyrus by his cuffed arms to lead him to a horse. The finality of it, the cold iron, the shame, finally broke through the bourbon. He balked, pulling against the marshal, his eyes wild. He saw Tamsin. "Tamsin!" he shrieked, his voice a pathetic, tearing sound. "Tamsin! You can't let them do this, Tassie! Please, I'm your brother! I'm your blood!" The yard went silent. Every man, prisoner and lawman alike, turned to look. Tamsin turned, her boots making a slow, sucking sound as she walked away from the safety of her horse, crossing the open, ruined yard to face him. She stopped 10 feet away. Calder, on the porch, tensed, his hands clenching into fists. But he stayed. He rooted himself to the spot. This was not his blood, Tamsin said. Her voice was not loud. It was not a shout. It was a low, clear, carrying sound, sharp as a piece of broken glass. "Blood," she repeated, "is not a license. Cyrus, it is not a permit to turn me into your next empty bottle." She took a step closer. He flinched. "You didn't see blood when you sold me at the line camp. You didn't see blood when you heated that iron. And you didn't see blood when you traded me for a whiskey tab at the Blue Kestrel. You saw a commodity. You saw something you could use until it was empty. And now," she looked him up and down, at the trembling, weeping, broken man in irons. "You are the empty bottle." Cyrus had no answer. He just sobbed, snot and tears running down his face. Tamsin turned from him. Her gaze found Calder on the porch. It was a long, silent, unbroken look. He held it for a beat. Then he understood. He turned, walked into the house, and reappeared a moment later. He was carrying the heavy, buckskin pouch. He walked across the yard, past the judge, past the marshals, and he did not hand the pouch to any of them. He walked to Tamsin. He placed the heavy bag of gold, the price he had paid, into her open, muddy hands. She turned and walked to Judge Elias Dovell. The judge closed his ledger and faced her. He was a tall man, but in that moment, she seemed to tower over him. "Judge," Tamsin said, holding the gold out. It clinked, a heavy, metallic sound. "This is the gold Mr. Wynne paid for me at the saloon in Alder Mesa." Dovell raised an eyebrow. "It is evidence, ma'am. It belongs—" "No," Tamsin interrupted, her voice firm. "It is not evidence. It is a price. It was the price of a human being. And I will not have it said that I was bought for a bag of gold, and that this gold is now my property." She pushed the bag into the judge's startled hands. "This gold, I am returning it to the law, not as evidence, but as a fee to the court, to have it written, to have it stamped, to have it recorded for all time that from that moment in the saloon, my freedom belongs to me, not to him." She jerked her head at Calder. "And not to him." She pointed at Cyrus. "To me. This is the payment to make the law see that." There was a stunned silence. Maeve Holliday was smiling, her eyes shining. Tamsin was not finished. She turned her gaze back to her brother. "He has a weapon, the pistol Deacon Pike gave him. I want it taken. I want it destroyed. It is the price of his betrayal." She looked back at the judge. "And I want a paper. Judge, a legal document. I want him to sign it, or make his mark on it. And I want you to stamp it. A paper that says he relinquishes all claim to me, that he is not my brother, not my kin, not my keeper, in the eyes of the law, that he can never come near my property, or my person, or my life, ever again. I want him gone." "No," Cyrus wailed. "Tamsin, no, you can't. I'm all you have. I took care of you after Ma. After she, I did my best. I've always done my best for you." He was dissolving, a puddle of self-pity. "She's lying. She's been bewitched by this killer. He's turned her. She's not thinking right." "She is thinking," a voice snapped. Nettie Quayle, her face a mask of iron, stalked forward. "She's thinking for the first time without a drunkard's hand near her throat. I am a witness. Judge, I saw his marks on her a month ago. I saw what he calls doing his best. And I am a witness," Maeve Holliday said, stepping up on Tamsin's other side, her good arm linked through Tamsin's. "I witnessed her affidavit, and I witnessed the liquor bill, the one where he signed his name to selling her. He is a liar. She is telling the truth." The three women stood together, Tamsin, Maeve, and Nettie, a wall of unassailable fact. Calder watched from the porch. His heart was a hammer in his chest. He had never in his life seen anything so strong. He kept his arms crossed, his face a mask. He was the wall she could lean on. But he knew, with a sudden, aching pride, that she would never need to. She was a wall all on her own. Cyrus looked from Maeve to Nettie, and his lies crumbled. He had nothing left. Judge Dovell looked at the three women. He looked at Cyrus, defeated. He looked at Calder, who gave a single, slow nod of confirmation. "Marshal," the judge commanded, his voice sharp. "Search the prisoner, Cyrus Rowe. Confiscate his weapons." The marshal, with a grim distaste, patted Cyrus down. From the waistband, he pulled the new, gleaming Navy Colt. He handed it, butt first, to the judge. "This weapon is forfeit to the court," Dovell declared. He turned. "Marshal, my travel desk." The small, folding wooden desk was brought from his horse. Dovell laid a clean sheet of foolscap on it, uncorked his ink, and dipped a fresh nib. His pen began to fly, scratching across the paper. "A writ of relinquishment," he said, speaking as he wrote. "I, Cyrus Rowe, being of sound mind, do hereby and forever renounce, forfeit, and relinquish any and all familial claims, rights, or authorities, past, present, and future over the person, property, and life of Tamsin Rowe. I do this under penalty of law, witnessed by this court, in perpetuity." He finished with a flourish. He blew on the ink. "Bring him here." The marshal dragged Cyrus, his feet sliding in the mud, to the desk. I can't, my hands are—" "Then you will make your mark," the judge said, his voice devoid of pity. He uncapped the ink pad. The marshal seized Cyrus's cuffed hands, jammed his thumb onto the black pad, and pressed it, hard. At the bottom of the document, a black, smeared print. "Signed," Judge Dovell said, signing his own name with a scratch. "Witnessed," Maeve said, stepping forward to sign. "And witnessed," Nettie added, her signature firm and clear. The judge folded the document. He picked up the heavy territorial stamp and pressed it hard into the ink, then onto the paper. Thud. He did not file the paper. He did not keep it. He turned and handed it to Tamsin. "This court is adjourned," he said. He looked at the heavy bag of gold in his other hand. "And the fees for this session are paid in full." He turned to the marshals. "Take them away. Pike goes to the federal line. He'll stand trial in Santa Fe. Cyrus Rowe and the rest of this armed rabble will be transported to the territorial jail in Larkspur. They will be tried for armed insurrection, assault on a court officer, and a dozen other charges." The marshals pulled Cyrus away. He was a hollow man, his sobs empty and dry. Pike, his face a mask of pure, white-hot hatred, his hands bound, his shoulders screaming, was forced onto a horse beside him. Tamsin stood, the legal paper clutched in her hand. She watched the column form. She watched the marshal take the lead. She watched Cyrus, a broken shape, slump in the saddle. And then, as the horses began to move, Tamsin Rowe turned her back. She did not watch them go. She did not give them the satisfaction of her gaze. Her victory was not in their departure. It was in her choice to no longer see them. She turned, her shoulders back, and walked, her boots sure in the mud, toward the house. As she walked, The world seemed to exhale. The bright, cold sun was suddenly obscured, and a fine, soft mist began to fall. It was not a storm. It was a cleansing. It pattered on the roof, on the mud, and on her face, washing away the sulfur and the sweat, the smell of the wet earth. The new earth rose up, sharp and clean as a promise. Maeve and Nettie walked with her to the porch. Nettie, her face full of a fierce, maternal pride, just grabbed Tamsin's arm and squeezed it, hard. A soldier's salute. Maeve, her eyes brimming, pulled Tamsin into a fierce, one-armed hug. She pressed her cheek against Tamsin's hair. "It's done," Maeve whispered, her voice thick. "It's all done. You don't belong to Cyrus. You don't belong to Calder. You don't belong to anyone." She pulled back, her hands on Tamsin's shoulders, her eyes locking on hers. "Except yourself." Tamsin closed her eyes, just for a second. She clutched the paper to her chest, and for the first time, she smiled. A real, slow, aching smile, as the clean rain fell. The yard was quiet. The storm had passed. The battle was over, and the procession of law and consequence had faded over the high ridge. The mud, churned by cattle and men, was already beginning to dry in the late afternoon sun, which broke through the clouds in heavy, golden shafts. The air, washed clean, smelled of pine, wet earth, and a profound, bone-deep peace. All the noise was gone. The shouts, the gunfire, the hiss of the flare, the clang of irons. Cyrus's final, desperate wail, it had all evaporated, leaving a silence that was vast and new. Tamsin stood on the porch. She had washed her face and hands in the rain barrel, the clean, cold water a balm. Maeve, before she left, had pressed a small bundle into her hands, a clean work shirt and a sturdy blue skirt. Tamsin had changed, and the feel of the rough, clean cotton against her skin felt like a new beginning. She was watching Calder. He was not at the barn. He was not mending the broken corral. He was down by the bank of Bitter Creek, near the tall, solitary pine that marked the edge of the main yard. He was working, his movements sure and steady. He had 2 long, smooth-barked cedar poles, and he was sinking them into the damp earth, lashing a third across the top. He was building a simple, unadorned arch. It was not a gate. It was not a fence. It was just a threshold, a doorway to nowhere. Standing against the open sky, Tamsin walked toward him, her boots making soft sounds in the damp earth. Down by the creek, the Palomino mare grazed peacefully, and Juniper, the tiny foal who had been the cause of their first real partnership, was testing her legs, making short, wobbly dashes through the tall grass. The foal was a promise of survival, a living, breathing symbol of a future that, just days ago, had been unimaginable. Tamsin stopped a few feet away. Calder finished his work, tamping the earth at the base of the second pole with his boot. He stood, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. He looked at the arch, then at her. "Judge Double," he said, his voice quiet, almost rough, as if he were afraid of breaking the stillness. Before he left, he offered to stay. He had his book with him. He offered to make it official. He said, after a fight like that, it was the least he could do. Tamsin said nothing, just watched him. I told him no. Calder said. He looked at her, his gray eyes clear and serious. I told him that wasn't what this was about. That's not what you fought for. A ring, a line in a book, it's just another kind of rope, another kind of price. He turned to face her fully. The late afternoon sun was heavy and gold, catching the lines at the corners of his eyes and the stubble on his jaw. This, he gestured to the simple cedar frame. This is just a place to say what needs to be said, clear, with no guns and no gold, and no one else to bear witness. Just us and the sky. He took a step toward her. He didn't reach for her. He stood, his hands open at his sides, a man who had held his whole life at a distance, now voluntarily closing the gap. Tamsin Rowe, he began, and his voice was the sound of a man trying to find words he had never spoken. He put his broad, calloused hand flat on his own chest, over the small, hidden braid of Juniper's hair. You are not bought. You are not sold. He said the words like a creed. You are not mine. He spoke the word as if it were a curse, a thing he was renouncing. Everyone is gone. The gate is open. The lock on your loft door is gone. I took it off this morning, before the fight. There is nothing holding you here. If you want to ride Mistral out of here tomorrow, if you want to go to Brimstone and work with Maeve, if you want to go east, I will open that gate. I will fill your saddlebags, and that will be the end of it. You are free. That is the truth I paid for. He took a breath, and it was ragged. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the creek. But if you want to stay, he said, and his voice dropped. If you choose to stay, I will spend every day of my life being the man you chose. He struggled, this man of actions, lost in a world of words. Tamsin, I will. She stopped him. She moved in that last step, closing the space between them, and laid her fingers gently against his lips. He went utterly still. The air was electric. She looked into his eyes, and she smiled. It was not the hesitant smile from the kitchen, nor the hard, battle-forged smile of the morning. This was a smile of pure, blinding daylight. It was a smile of total, unadulterated choice. Calder, she whispered, her voice clear as the water running beside them. I choose. He did not pull her. He did not grab her. His hands came up, slowly, as if he were handling something impossibly precious, and cupped her face. Her own hands found his waist, her fingers gripping the rough cotton of his shirt, and he kissed her. It was not the desperate, clinging kiss from the storm-tossed barn, a moment of two souls finding ballast. It was not the breathless, questioning kiss in the dark kitchen. This was a kiss of absolute, devastating certainty. It was the kiss of arrival. It was slow and deep and sure, a promise sealed not in words, but in the simple, profound truth of the moment. It was the ground, solid and real, beneath their feet. It was the first clean breath after a lifetime of running. It was the flood, not of a violent storm, but of the spring thaw, powerful, inevitable, and bringing new, clean life. It was every fear answered, every battle won, every doubt erased. It was the home they had built, right there, in the middle of a muddy yard. She pulled back, just enough to breathe, and rested her forehead against his. His arms were solid around her, holding her as if she were the only real thing in the world. The last, faint echo of the departing prison convoy was gone. The past was, finally, over the ridge. There was only the sound of their own breathing and the quiet whisper of the wind in the needles of the tall pine. The wind, gentle now, lifted the brim of his hat, still on his head. It played with a long, damp strand of her hair. The sun, sinking toward the ridge, turned the entire basin into a bowl of liquid gold, pouring honey over her hair and face. Tamsin's gaze moved from his face to her horse. Mistral was standing patiently nearby, and tied to her bridle, a muddy, torn, and tattered flag, was the blue silk scarf, her battle standard. She stepped away from Calder. Though he did not release her hand, she walked to Mistral and, with a kind of reverence, she untied the ruined, precious piece of silk. She walked back to him, standing under the simple cedar arch. She did not tie it around her neck. The faint, pale line was part of her history. It no longer needed to be hidden. She took his left hand, his broad, scarred hand that had cut her free. She took her own right hand, and with a muddy, torn, beautiful scrap of silk, she loosely, gently, wrapped them together, her wrist to his. Freedom, she whispered, her fingers deftly tying a simple knot. Bound to freedom. She looked up, her eyes, the color of a winter sky, locking on his. It is not a shackle, Calder, it is a promise. He looked at their joined hands. He looked at her face, illuminated, transfigured by the golden light, and he smiled. A slow, real smile that erased the hard lines of the lonely rancher. Leaving only the man, he said it. The words he had spoken in the saloon, the words that had begun it all. But they were not a purchase. They were not a claim. They were a question, an invitation. The final choice. She rides with me now, he said, his voice low and soft, meant only for her. If you still want to. Tamsin Rowe, who had been traded for whiskey, hunted for a lie, and had won her own name in the mud of a ranch yard, did not hesitate. Her hand tightened in his. Her eyes were bright, fierce, and full of a future she had never dared to imagine. I do. He released the knot. The promise was sealed. He turned, and in one fluid, powerful motion, swung up onto his bay. Tamsin turned to Mistral, and with the easy grace of a woman who was where she belonged, she mounted the gray mare. They sat their horses side by side, framed by the simple cedar arch, facing the setting sun. Two riders, equal and free. Where to? Calder, she asked, her hands light on the reins. He didn't point to the house. He didn't point to the gate. He pointed west, toward the high, open ridge, where the last light of the day was blazing like a bonfire. Anywhere, he said. He kicked his bay. Tamsin kicked Mistral. Together, they charged down the bank and hit Bitter Creek. The water, clear and clean, exploded around them, not in a muddy spray, but in a shower of pure, golden light. They drove their horses up the far bank, rising out of the shadows of the basin, and into the full, brilliant, blinding fire of the sun. They did not look back. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from. And share your thoughts on the story. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. If you'd like to support us further, please hit the hype button so this story can be heard by even more listeners.